Hello, I am Brian Fredricks. I am about to present my recent study concerning motivation and retention of middle school orchestra students, which was an application of self-determination theory. Orchestra programs in the United States have seen smaller and smaller recruitment rates for decades, going back to studies from the 90s to 2010 and beyond. Only 42% of U.S. public schools even employ a music teacher. Even then, only 41% of middle schools employ an orchestra teacher. Ingersoll reported that less students enroll in orchestra because there are less orchestra teachers compared to other music teachers. But this hypothesizes a very bad reinforcing cycle where less orchestra teachers means less orchestra students, which in turn means when those students grow up, they will be even less likely to become orchestra teachers. Part of the inspiration for this action research study was a deeply felt commitment to advocate for choral and instrumental music, especially orchestra. Students should be given an opportunity to begin orchestra during elementary school. But realistically, most students in the U.S. begin orchestra instruction in middle school, so recruitment during that time is imperative. Here is some background for this study. Like many music educators, I am interested in recruiting and retaining not only the students who are best fit for my program, but as many of them as possible, so I can have the biggest impact as a music educator. My professional background is middle school orchestra, but scant motivation and retention research has been conducted specifically for middle school orchestra students. So in my literature review, I explored the different motivation perspectives on music education, including attribution theory, musical self-efficacy, then specifically the motivation of middle school orchestra students, including their musical self-efficacy and self-determination, and if any of these perspectives have an effect on students' enrollment and retention in orchestra. According to attribution theory, internal attributions, or ability and effort, affect the success of students. Self-efficacy describes the beliefs about one's ability to accomplish musical goals. The way Bandura defined self-efficacy was the beliefs in one's capabilities to organize and execute the courses of action required to produce given attainments. Finally, self-determination theory describes an intrinsic motivation which sustains students' innate disposition to learn. Martin investigated the musical self-efficacy beliefs of middle school band students with the Schmidt self-efficacy scale to 45 students. The results indicated that teachers should consider the words they use toward students in verbal feedback. Cook determined what factors contribute to orchestra students' attrition when transitioning from elementary to middle school. Cook modified the exact same Schmidt self-efficacy scale and gave it to 43 students who were in elementary school orchestra but dropped out before middle school orchestra started. Her results indicated orchestra teachers should meet and recruit students in their feeder schools. Meeting middle school students and middle school teachers while still in the 5th grade could assist those students to make an educated decision whether to remain in orchestra or leave. The most recent study resembling the present study is Howard, surveying 378 middle school band students. Howard examined various motivators associated with student decision-making and investigated the impact of those motivators on a student's band participation during middle school. Howard found out that the decision to stay or drop from band was influenced by family support, peer influence, relationship with the teacher, and possibility of enjoyment of future performance opportunities, basic enjoyment, and musical success. Liu surveyed high school orchestra students to examine the association between fulfillment of psychological needs, which are competence, relatedness, and autonomy, experienced by high school orchestra students and their perceived level of autonomy supportive learning. In that study, the mean scores of competence, relatedness, and autonomy declined from 9th to 11th grade. Evans and Liu examined the effect on psychological needs, competence, relatedness, and autonomy of exclusively orchestra students by measuring predictors of 3 important outcomes in music education related to motivation: practice time, intentions to continue learning music, and self-esteem. Their model accounted for a good percentage of the variance for each of the outcomes, but by far the biggest impact was on intentions to continue, or retention. Teachers could help competence by providing accurate feedback to students and teaching practice skills. For relatedness, teachers could start small group or partner practice, and they could develop autonomy by building up the value of music. According to Evans and Liu, lifting up those three needs could allow music educators to more effectively motivate their students. Moving on to this study's problem statement. The first key concept of self-determination theory is basic psychological needs, which form basic motives for psychological well-being. The second key concept is internalization, or aligning external behaviors with the self. If psychological needs, which are competence, relatedness, and autonomy, are met, psychological growth may occur. But if those needs are not met, the result is psychological ill-being. Before this study, scant research had been conducted connecting motivation, self-efficacy, self-determination, and retention of middle school orchestra students. The purpose of this study was to investigate the fulfillment of middle school orchestra students' three basic psychological needs as outlined in self-determination theory: competence, relatedness, and autonomy, and whether the fulfillment of those psychological needs affects their motivation to continue in string music class. The research questions were: does the musical self-efficacy or competence affect orchestra students' decisions to remain in or leave orchestra? How influential is family involvement and social and peer influences, or relatedness, in regard to motivation and decision-making for middle school orchestra students? And how important are a student's sense of enjoyment and personal satisfaction, or autonomy, in regard to motivation for a middle school orchestra student? Next, I will discuss this study's methodology. This study was limited to a sample of about 60 6th, 7th, and 8th grade students from a single middle school in a single school district who enrolled in orchestra. Because this study was action research, the sample was a convenient sample made up of the orchestra classes in one school taught by the researcher. The students were enrolled in orchestra class for the 2020-2021 school year. I teach 71 orchestra students total, so 60 responses isn't bad. The students completed an online survey on Google Forms using a 4-point Likert type scale, from strongly disagree to agree to strongly agree, with no neutral option. The Chromebox Alpha for each scale, with the exception of family involvement, was at least 0.71, with a few hitting 0.80. Overall, the most items in all sections needed to be reworded to be more middle school specific. The first section, competence, was modified from the Schmidt self-efficacy scale. The second section, family involvement, was created using an amalgamation of Brown, Cook, and a couple items from Howard. Section 3, measuring relatedness, and Section 4, measuring autonomy, were both created using items from the web-based survey developed by Howard. All the sections included positive and negative statements to raise their validity. In the data analysis, I calculated all the frequencies and descriptive statistics using the Statistical Package for the Social Sciences, or SPSS, created by IBM. I displayed frequency analyses with several tables and figures. In addition to internal consistency, frequencies, and descriptive statistics, different research questions require me to calculate independent samples t-test, a Pearson product moment correlation coefficient, and multiple regression. To answer my first research question, I ran an independent samples t-test between the scores for 6th and 7th grade, finding the 6th graders had a higher mean competence score than 7th grade, but it was non-significant. I also ran a Pearson product moment correlation coefficient to assess the relationship between students' assessment of their own competence and their own assessment of their retention in orchestra. There was a strong positive correlation between both variables. To answer my second research question, I ran a Pearson product moment correlation coefficient to assess the relationship between family involvement and orchestra retention, or deciding to remain in or leave orchestra. There was a strong positive correlation between family involvement in the orchestra and retention. Then, to answer my third research question, I calculated multiple regression using the scores from the enjoyment and satisfaction measures to predict the motivation of orchestra students. The results were significant, with an amazing 76% of the variability of student motivation accounted for by enjoyment and satisfaction. The results support the theory of autonomy as a tool to predict the motivation of middle school orchestra students. Moving on to the rest of the results, the first thing I needed to calculate was Chromebox alpha for every scale I used in order to test its internal consistency. A reliable scale is generally 0.70 or higher, and the family involvement Chromebox alpha was only 0.58. That was a limitation of this study. However, as you can see in Table 1, every other scale reported at least a 0.71. Another limitation of this study was the somewhat lopsided response rate between 6th grade, 7th grade, and 8th grade. 45% of the respondents were 8th grade orchestra students, and 21.7% were 6th graders, which is less than half the number of 8th graders that responded. For the first research question, the more the students agreed, the higher their competence. These are the 7th grade responses to the competence scale. Green is strongly disagree, yellow is disagree, red is agree, and blue is strongly agree. The 6th graders have more blue and red responses. Therefore, as you can see, the 6th grade competence was slightly higher than the 7th grade. This scatter plot shows the strong positive correlation between total competence of the students and their retention scores. For the second research question, this scatter plot shows the strong positive correlation between total family involvement of the students and their retention scores. Here are the scores for 6th grade relatedness. Not a single 6th grader answered positively to the item, "I chose the instrument I play because my friend plays it too." The 6th grade relatedness in this sample appears to be slightly lower than 7th grade and lower still than 8th grade relatedness score. 26% in 6th grade compared to about 30% in 8th grade. The greatest number of positive responses to an item went to the 8th grade class, who mostly positively answered, "I have friends in orchestra." 8th grade orchestra students knew each other the best before the 2020-2021 virtual learning started, while none of the 6th graders had met during the same school year when they completed the survey. A plurality of all the participants disagreed with the statement, "I do not plan to stay in orchestra even if my friends quit," which is a good sign regarding self-determination. Continuing with the second research question, related to parental involvement and relatedness, you can tell the scores were low in this action research study. According to the data, the only remotely agreeable rating was the statement, "I have friends in orchestra." Only 2 students agreed with the statement, "I don't like my orchestra teacher," and of course, they were both in the 8th grade. Now, to the third research question, related to autonomy and its effect on motivation. These are the 6th grade frequencies, and you can see that not a single 6th grade student thought orchestra was boring. However, while none of the 6th graders thought orchestra was boring, 11 8th graders thought orchestra was boring to an extent, as you can see here. Now we see that 5 7th graders also thought orchestra was boring. Considering how instrumental music students tend to gain other interests and distractions as they get older, it makes sense more and more of them would believe orchestra is boring as they get into the 7th and the 8th grade. Lastly, both the predictor variables, enjoyment and personal satisfaction, significantly contributed to the relationship with motivation. Therefore, as shown in this figure, the expected cumulative probability strongly correlated with the observed cumulative probability. I will now move on to the conclusion. The purpose of this study was to investigate the fulfillment of middle school orchestra students' 3 basic psychological needs as outlined in self-determination theory: competence, relatedness, and autonomy, and whether the fulfillment of those 3 psychological needs affects their motivation to continue in string music class. My first research question was, does musical self-efficacy, or competence, affect orchestra students' decision to remain in or leave orchestra? To answer this, the relationship between musical competence and whether a student wanted to continue or drop orchestra, or retention, was very significant and positive, with 73% of the variability accounted for between the 2 variables. Low scores on all 3 scales could have been influenced by the COVID-19 pandemic, which resulted in widespread virtual learning across the United States during the 2020-2021 school year. Among all 3 grades, 6th, 7th, and 8th, the 7th grade orchestra students appeared to hold the lowest competence, or self-efficacy score. 6th grade students had the most enthusiasm in their responses, especially self-efficacy. The relationship between musical competence and whether a student wanted to continue or drop orchestra was very significant and positive, with 73% of the variability accounted for between the two variables. My second research question was, how influential is family involvement and social and peer influences or relatedness in regard to motivation and decision-making for middle school orchestra students? To answer this, the relationship between relatedness and orchestra retention was significant and positive, with 53% of the variability accounted for between the two variables. My third research question was, how important are a student's sense of enjoyment and personal satisfaction, or autonomy, in regard to motivation for a middle school orchestra student? First of all, the percentile autonomy score for all participants was 77.5%, a very acceptable score considering the virtual learning that took place nationwide during the 2020 to 2021 school year. The answer to the question is that motivation highly correlates with autonomy, with 76% of the variability in motivation accounted for by enjoyment and satisfaction. Autonomy has been defined as people's need to feel that the things they are hoping are aligned with their interests and stem from their sense of self. It is frustrating when one feels controlled by other people or social conditions rather than by themselves. Every music student agreed with the statement, "I like my orchestra teacher," which correlated with a higher relatedness score and higher motivation. To boost autonomy, students should get a voice when choosing performance literature, even if it is limited to solo and small ensemble performances. Teachers can also boost student autonomy by allowing them to retake playing tests, incentivizing growth instead of simply what they achieved, and introducing concepts to kick off discovery of music outside school, such as music writing, composition competitions, or in school still, ideation and improvisation. My study supported the idea that students learn more about their instrument and the way music is organized when given a more autonomous environment to thrive in. Now, I will discuss the implications of my action research study. Future cycles of action research should investigate even more specific reasons orchestra students remain in or drop orchestra. Orchestra students' parents could complete their own survey, clearing up exactly why their children did not sign up for orchestra or dropped it. Using a more qualitative examination, teachers could consider allowing students to openly respond to the question of why they remain in or dropped orchestra class. Unlike the high school orchestra students in Lou and Evans and Lou, my study surveyed the basic psychological needs of middle school orchestra students. The scores in the present study also corroborate Howard by highlighting the key decision-making aspects of middle school orchestra: musical success and performance opportunities, or competence, music-teacher relationship, peer pressure, and family involvement, or relatedness, and enjoyment and satisfaction, or autonomy. Teachers can build student confidence by allowing vicarious learning, or competence. Thanking students for preparing for concerts or affirmation will improve their relatedness. We can also build autonomy by letting them choose and value the music they are learning. In closing, this study supports that boosting students' self-determination theory, psychological needs, competence, relatedness, and autonomy can support middle school orchestra retention. Thank you for watching and listening to my presentation. I learned so much about my own teaching and consequences of that teaching during this action research project. Just digging into this data really gave me a new perspective on what my students are thinking and feeling about my class, orchestra. As instrumental and choral teachers, we are in the business of recruiting and retaining as many students as possible and spreading the gift of music and musical skills. I was given a chance to see how my students interact with each other, with their families, and of course, how they interact with me as their teacher. It was fascinating to see how all these factors affect student motivation, self-efficacy, and whether they want to stay in orchestra or drop. Motivation has really been an eye-opening subject to delve into. Anyway, thanks again for viewing this today. I'm Brian Fredricks, and this last slide is my references.